As we have explained in the first video, philosophy is a way of understanding without presumptions. According to Hegel, there is a necessary assumption though, without which philosophy cannot even begin. And that assumption is the fact of thinking itself. When we express this assumption, we need to use the concept of a being. In that way, the assumption of philosophy is not outside philosophy, but an integral part of it. It is the beginning of our philosophical system. Now we may analyze the assumption of being. The necessary assumption is made consciously, and it is examined. Philosophy should be knowledge that demonstrates the necessity of what is being thought. Everyone can formulate opinions about truth. Everyone can pretend to have found a truth. But in that manner, philosophy is not yet a real form of knowledge, it is not a real science. Hegel does not mean to say that philosophy has a formal necessity. That would mean that a philosophical discourse is formally valid and does not transgress against the rules of logic. Now, of course, it should indeed be formally coherent and conceptually precise. But these demands are merely the necessary conditions of a true philosophy, not yet the sufficient condition. Hegel wants to maintain that philosophy should demonstrate the necessity of its contents, not merely abide by formal rules. We can give an example to clarify this idea. Let us take the concept of freedom, the most important idea in social philosophy. There are several ways of defining the concept of freedom. One might say that freedom consists of the ability to make choices between contradictory options. Freedom of choice. One might say that freedom is defined by the ability to act without being restrained by something external. Freedom might also be truly social, so that the ability to choose is embedded in society. To be able to choose is then less important than the values that we ought to choose, and then we prefer to use the word liberty. How does philosophy normally deal with this? After having made a definition, it analyzes the definition itself and expresses the implications of the definition systematically. But does that demonstrate the necessity of thought? When we think like this, we have constructed some idea of freedom and analyzed its contents, but we have not demonstrated that we had to think like this and that no other way of thinking was possible. In other words, the definition is still taken at random, probably from our experiences and prejudices, and we have not demonstrated why it is necessary to define it like this. The question still needs to be asked: how must freedom be thought? When we combine these two basic ideas about the nature of philosophy, we must conclude that philosophy can only exist as the exposition of a whole, a systematic totality of thoughts and propositions. The idea of freedom must be shown to be necessary by demonstrating the necessity of all other categories and ideas that are the presuppositions of freedom. The exposition of truth is therefore the exposition of a systematic whole. This exposition of the whole is expressed by the word speculative. It is this basic insight that has led Hegel to state that the true is the whole. Of course, in this course on Hegel's social philosophy, we cannot even begin to present this whole. Any introduction to Hegel's philosophy will fall short in comparison to Hegel's systematic philosophy. That is, however, the fate of all introductions. We still need to explain how philosophy can achieve this demonstration of the necessary character of its statements. It is not enough to argue that it must exposit truth as a whole. So we must talk about the method of dialectics. Hegel states that the method is the awareness of the form in which the contents of thinking move itself. Philosophical knowledge is not an instrument that we apply externally to a given reality, but an expression of what moves a content. By content, we mean a thought, a concept, or a proposition. Examining and analyzing a concept like freedom should follow the inner movement of that content. Any idea should be allowed to develop itself, to go through the various stages of its ultimate shape. We should allow it to exposit its inner determinations. That is how we might achieve to demonstrate its necessity. Philosophy's method is not some form of thought that is applied to a randomly given set of thoughts. What we call method is the self-movement of a thought. This movement of a thought by itself, that philosophers need to affirm and express, is what Hegel calls dialectics. Dialectic is not a form that we can decide to use or not. It is the inner character of any thought. Rationality can only exist in the shape of dialectics. It is an internal characteristic of thinking. Every determinate thought has this dialectical character. So we must ask the question, what is dialectics? Hegel defines it as follows. The dialectic moment or stage in the movement of thought is the moment in which finite thoughts turn into their opposites. Finite reason, that is the rationality that is commonly presupposed and applied in philosophy, sets up definite thoughts and is content with making distinctions between these thoughts. Every one of these thoughts is finite, has a limit, and a steady identity within these limits. The red ends where blue begins, the good ends where evil begins, etc. All thoughts are understood to be a complex infinite series of determinations that are set side by side without touching each other. To focus on the differences implies the notion that one thought is indifferent to another. They are separated by their limit. The only way to bring them together is therefore by connecting them into a proposition. When I say that the table is red, I am combining two separate and finite concepts into one statement about reality. This connection between finite concepts is external and needs a reference to experience to be true. Hegel argues against this form of rationality by stating that the difference between two concepts is vital to the meaning of each of them. The difference between thoughts constitutes their meaning. What something is, can only be expressed by relating it to what it is not. In the famous dictum by Spinoza, every determination is a negation. If the good were the only thing that existed, and bad would not exist, we would not be able to think of the good. An individual that would be conformed to the collective it belongs to, would no longer be an individual. To be an individual requires an act of negation, the act of differentiating oneself from the collective while being part of it at the same time. It is this insight that defines Hegel's way of thinking from the start. Reality and thought are both finite. Negation permeates reality and thought so that without negation there would not be any determinate thought. Reality is a whole of opposites, that include and exclude each other. That is why every determinacy is in movement. It is always in transition to something other than itself. Thoughts are characterized by an inner contradiction. That is because they are what they are in distinction to other thoughts, and yet they have derived their determinacy from the very thoughts that they exclude. Take for instance the idea of a human being. Man is a living being and therefore mortal. This mortality is not an additional characteristic of man by way of external circumstances. Mortality is essential to what is alive. Everything that lives contains within it the possibility of death. The living have an essential connection to their deaths, which determines what life means. To live means to live as mortals. So the concept of life transits into something else, because of this inner contradiction. Nothing is eternal, nothing is set in stone, but every thought and every reality is in movement and loses its identity and turns into something else. If all thoughts are essentially contradictions or negations, why not argue in favor of skepticism? For a skeptic, the contradiction does not have a positive meaning. He would conclude that every thought and every reality is destroyed by its inner contradiction. Contradictions in Hegel's thought, however, are moments or stages that lead to a higher truth. The movement of a contradiction, such as that between being and nothing, leads to a new positivity, and that is the concept of becoming. In that concept, the meaning of both being and nothing is maintained and preserved. But becoming also expresses their contradiction. Becoming indeed is both the idea of nothing as the negation of being and being as the negation of nothing. Becoming means both at the same time. What is, transits into nothingness, what is not, transits into being. In our everyday way of thinking, this would be an absurdity. What is contradictory is destroyed and turns into zero. That is the meaning of the principle of non-contradiction that is presupposed in almost every kind of philosophy. It states that formally, when two propositions contradict each other, only one or none can be true. Hegel contends that actually, both sides of a contradiction are true. Contradiction is not the last thing that happens to a thought, but it is a mediation, a transition to a higher unity. This unity is called the speculative synthesis, the positively rational, that expresses the unity out of which the contradictory thoughts came forth. At the same time, the speculative synthesis also expresses the result of the movement of contradiction. In our last example, we might say that a becoming is both the result and the origin of the contradiction between being and nothing. On this basis, we can now turn to the infamous definition of Hegel's dialectics as a simple formality. That is how unfortunately his way of thinking is characterized. The most formal way of explaining dialectics runs according to a very well-known argument. We have an expression of a thought, A. We must formulate its contradiction, B, that is non-A. We can formulate their synthesis, A plus B then becomes AB. And then we start with AB, which we rewrite as something positive, and C. We must formulate its contradiction, D that is non-C. And then the synthesis, C plus D becomes CD. Why is it necessary to formulate its contradiction? Because that is the necessary way to determine what any thought means. Etc., etc. But based on our introduction to this dialectics, it is now clear that it is not an external and formal way of thinking. In this manner, Hegel tries to describe the inner momentum of every thought and proposition. It is a sense of applied skepticism because every thought can be contradicted, and every proposition loses its truth in the confrontation with its opposite. The only reality that truly exists is the reality of this moving whole, that exposits and expresses itself. For Hegel, that means that the whole of reality, including thought, is spirit.